First time that I participate in their meeting. I also want to congratulate the Vascular Society of Rio de Janeiro for heroic 25 years of survival and success. I was part of this history and I'm very proud of it, and nothing will have kept me out of this meeting. So I have 8 minutes, and I'm going to very quickly make my point that small popliteal aneurysms should not be left alone and should be treated. I wish I had a debater, but if you read the Journal of Vascular Surgery in a couple of months and the European Journal of Vascular Surgery, we have a debate between us and the English about the same subject. Well, since John Hunter called our attention to the fact that popliteal aneurysms can be fixed, we know that this is the most common peripheral arterial aneurysm in the body, the popliteal. And Hajmovici spent some time looking at the entire literature a few years back, and he found that most of these popliteal aneurysms actually thrombose, not necessarily rupture or embolize, but they thrombose. But they embolize more than they rupture. We have done a lot of work in the research laboratory on what exactly constitutes a popliteal aneurysm, and we found that it's very much like an aortic aneurysm. Why they don't rupture is hard to explain, because histologically they appear the same. They have also apoptotic cells, as you see with these yellow cells pointed up to you. Well, there's a consensus about what to do for a large aneurysm that is asymptomatic, a large aneurysm that is asymptomatic, and even a small symptomatic aneurysm. The question is what to do with the small popliteal aneurysm that is not symptomatic. And small popliteal aneurysm can go up to 1.2 cm in diameter, and people feel that that's innocuous and we shouldn't worry about it. Here's an example of a popliteal aneurysm that's less than 1.2, almost 1.2, with a huge thrombus sitting in the lumen. We feel that that's dangerous and that should not be left alone because of our own personal experience, which is certainly very biased. The controversy about popliteal aneurysms stems from the fact that there are very few series published on what to do with these patients. There's a limited follow-up. The definition of aneurysm is very questionable. Most of these cases were diagnosed by angiogram, and as you know, angiogram will miss the small aneurysm and the size of the aneurysm, and there has been limited use of duplex in diagnosis of these problems. See how can you easily, I don't know where the pointer is. Oh, here, how you can easily miss an aneurysm if you have a thickening of the thrombus up here. The flow will go right through it based on duplex or angiogram, and you miss a small popliteal aneurysm that can be the source of embolization in your patient. So, small popliteal aneurysms are benign, according to some authors, including Szilagyi, but they all have small cases. And some other things that are not benign, but they have equally small cases. So basically, we don't know the answer because we don't have a prospective study, or ideally would be a prospective randomized study for small aneurysms with at least 5 years follow-up. So I'm going to just show you quickly our experience with the management of these patients, and I'm going to concentrate on the small popliteal aneurysms with thrombus. The ones that don't have a thrombus, we don't operate, we don't fix, we just watch. But those have thrombus, we do something about it. And the reason for that is because we noticed, since we do so much duplex scan on these patients with claudication and acute ischemia, that there was a high incidence of thrombosed small popliteal aneurysm by duplex that was just not clinically unsuspected. And also that in some patients they had worse runoff, and yet they're not diabetic. So what are the other explanation except maybe this thrombus embolized distally? We have published on this subject, and although it's been now 8 years, we still have an increased experience proving the same thing that we initially mentioned, that they are dangerous. So over a 9-year period, we had 88 popliteal aneurysms in 74 patients, mostly males as expected. And again, because we do so much duplex, we're able to diagnose a lot of them. We had a high incidence of concomitant aneurysms in these patients, higher than the reported. I don't understand why, but that's what we found. The risk factors are basically the same ones you find in your practice with any atherosclerotic problems, patients. 1/3 were asymptomatic, and 2/3 of these were symptomatic, and 2/3 of those had chronic ischemia, were not acute ischemia. The size ranged from almost 1.2 to 8.6 with an average of 2.4. The small aneurysms were almost 50% according to our limited but large data. Asymptomatic patients had a 3.1 cm in diameter, and the symptomatic was 2.1. Interesting, the symptomatic aneurysms were smaller than the larger aneurysms. And they thrombose at the same rate, basically. The thrombosed aneurysms has a 2.5 cm average, and the patent one was 2.4 cm. So the fact that you have a thrombosed aneurysms does not prevent it from thrombosing. Here is 30% of the thrombosed cases were small aneurysms, and 24% of the large aneurysms had presented with thrombosis. Murothrombus was found in over 80% of the cases that had large aneurysms, and over 90% of the cases that had small aneurysms. And here's the thrombus, and we believe this can embolize distally. Well, in terms of runoff, we found that the asymptomatic and the symptomatic patients had different sort of runoff. The patients with symptoms had less runoff. But why is that? It's because they're diabetic? That's the biggest question. We also found that the small aneurysms had an average of 1.4 of patent arteries, and the large aneurysms were 1.6. So it's not that patients with the small aneurysm had better runoff and we don't have to worry about it. The question is, why is that? Is it because they're diabetic and there's a bias inherent in this analysis? The fact is 26% of the patients who had small aneurysms were diabetics, and 24% of the ones with large aneurysms were diabetics. So diabetes does not influence these results. So what else could it be that could clog these small arteries in these patients? So we fixed these patients with PTFE bypasses, and mostly now we're doing endovascular. And we have changed completely to doing an endovascular procedures lately in these patients. And we prefer to use the ultrasound guided because there's no dye injected, there is no radiation, and the whole procedure takes about 35 minutes from incision to removing the needle. Here's a patient that had an aneurysm, and after that I'm going to finalize it. And it's the puncture, and this was a common femoral artery. We're going to place the wire under direct vision into the popliteal artery. And we're going to manipulate the tip of the wire. Again, everything is done under direct vision through the aneurysm with a huge clot up here. Here's thrombus. And we're going to calculate, and it's below the knee, you can see the tibia. We have some difficulty passing through a stenosis. And now we're bringing the Viabond over, a cover stent over the aneurysm, and you can see the tip of it. You can know exactly where it ends, when it begins and when it ends. And we do measurements, perfectly measurements. We remove the string, and now it's open. We balloon it because there was a stenosis up here. And after that, they're basically done. So there's no dye, there's no need for anything. In transverse, you see there's no flow in the aneurysm anymore. It's been isolated. And basically, that's what we do on these patients. We feel that the procedure has low morbidity, extremely low mortality, and at least we prevent those embolizations from occurring in these patients with small aneurysms that have thrombus. Thank you very much.
Agora, para finalizar, gostaria de chamar o Dr. José Mussa Curi para apresentar a angioplastia de renal, indicações no controle pressórico ou na preservação da função renal.
Esse é do grupo de vocês.
Bom dia, né, ainda. Senhoras e senhores colegas, gostaria de parabenizar a sociedade por esses 25 anos de bem-sucedidos encontros e cumprimentar o Dr. Paulo Roberto, que está na mesa conosco, que foi quem deu o pontapé inicial para que isso ocorresse. A estenose da artéria renal é associada a duas síndromes: a hipertensão renovascular, que é secundária ao processo estenótico e ocorre em mais de 5% dos casos, e também a nefropatia isquêmica, que é a obstrução ao fluxo renal, que evolui com dano renal e, por conseguinte, disfunção excretora. Dos hipertensos, mais de 90% não apresentam alterações anatômicas, mas não quer dizer que o paciente com ausência de hipertensão não tenha estenose renal. O diagnóstico nós fazemos, se em suspeita clínica, com a utilização desses exames que estão aí mostrados, com a ultrassonografia renal, que avalia as dimensões do rim, o ecodoppler colorido, que nos dá o índice de resistência, a cintilografia renal e a angiorressonância, a angiotomografia, a angiografia, sendo que os problemas inerentes a cada um desses exames, como a magnificação pela ressonância, o problema do contraste na tomografia, E a angiografia, que é utilizada normalmente só para o tratamento, muitas das vezes ela é diagnóstica para o tratamento só com o diagnóstico ou continua. E isso tudo com gasto mínimo de contraste. E atualmente temos o dosagem do peptídeo nefropático cerebral, que é um preditor de sucesso para o procedimento. O quadro clínico é hipertensão, alteração da função renal, que pode ter por uma azotemia inexplicada, induzida por tratamento com antihipertensivos, rim de tamanho reduzido e uma hipocalemia inexplicada. A hipertensão e a alteração da função renal pode evoluir e manifestar sintomas cardiorrespiratórios, de repetição e até neurológicos. A ultrassonografia renal ela é utilizada para avaliar a anatomia renal, no caso, o tamanho, se é de bilateral ou unilateral comprometimento, e sabemos que a redução da massa renal está associada à elevação de creatinina, mais ou menos acima de 40%. O ecodoppler colorido, que nos dá o índice de resistência parenquimatosa, num trabalho feito por Rademacher, mostrou que em vários pacientes tratados com índice acima de 0,8, o resultado era menor, não evoluía com melhora nem da função renal e nem da hipertensão. Já aqueles que tinham um índice menor que 0,8 evoluíam bem, tanto clinicamente quanto da hipertensão, com melhora da função renal, e muitos deles deixavam de ir para a diálise. E esse BNP, peptídeo natriurético cerebral, é mais recentemente utilizado e indicador de sucesso para a angioplastia renal. Esse peptídeo, em níveis elevados, basais, em termos de 80, pode manter uma resposta boa após a angioplastia renal, e como preditor do funcionamento de retorno da função renal. Outros fatores, na prática, são sugestivos da recuperação da função renal, e que é o que nós mais observamos na prática clínica. É a obstrução crítica com opacificação do leito distal por colaterais, a excreção do meio de contraste durante a cintigrafia ou angiografia, glomérulos intactos pela biópsia, circulação intrarrenal preservada. Comprometimento vascular intrarrenal e baixo fluxo cortical é igual a um mau prognóstico. As contribuições técnicas ou tecnológicas, com a melhora dos dispositivos utilizados, o uso de filtro e também a melhora e a alternativa dos meios de contraste alternativos, como gadolínio, gás carbônico, isso melhorou, diminuíram as complicações e o resultado tornou-se melhor. As indicações são aquelas já bem conhecidas, com hipertensão grave, refratária ao tratamento, como as indicações clínicas, no caso. De início recente, com disfunção renal progressiva ou recorrência de edema agudo de pulmão. Nas anatômicas, as estenoses ostiais, maior ou igual a 70% ou maior que 50% a 70%, com repercussão hemodinâmica. Dilatação pré-estenótica com circulação colateral e a redução do tecido renal. A fisiológica é o gradiente pressórico transestenótico. Como conclusão, a angioplastia na estenose da artéria renal é atualmente um método seguro e eficiente no que concerne ao tratamento da hipertensão renovascular e da nefropatia isquêmica, trazendo benefícios aos pacientes portadores de doença renovascular, com melhora clínica da hipertensão e da função renal, desde que respeitado critérios de avaliação diagnóstica, a seleção de pacientes e a indicação específica para o tratamento da patologia. Muito obrigado.